Only a bishop could preach. And so the Pope gave Dominic permission to preach. And that's why his order is to this day called the Order of Preachers, that they were given the ability to preach. No other non-bishops at that time could preach, only the Dominicans. They were the preaching order. And so Dominic was given the ability to preach. And once Dominic got this, the focus of Dominic became his task, which is preaching. In the same way the focus of Francis became simplicity, Dominic's focus was in fact this preaching. And he gathered a group of people around him, and they basically took the rule of St. Augustine, tweaked by Benedict, and dropping stability, so that they're very similar to the Franciscans in the way they set up. And very quickly, as soon as he gathered his group, he dispersed them. A group went to Bologna, a group went to Paris, a group went to Spain, a small group went to Rome. And they went around and basically preached about this. But his spirituality focused entirely on preaching. Now, if you watch Dominic's setup, you have liturgy, and you have community, and you have all these different things that are important to the setup, but they're all aimed at preaching. And just to give you an example, Dominic really encouraged religious services. They would have Mass every day and stuff, but he forbid a religious service from becoming very elaborate. So like today, if you want to study liturgy, you go to a Benedictine monastery. You never go to a Dominican house, okay? The Dominicans, by their rule, is supposed to keep liturgy simple so they don't use up time for study and preaching, okay? You'll find everything in their thing is set up towards the goal of this. Another interesting thing is once the order got going, Dominic refused to be involved in the running of the order. And so what he did was organize what's called a chapter, which is representatives of different places of the order, and they made the rules. They begged Dominic to make the rules. He says, no, I can't be bothered. I need to preach. So he says, you go together and make your rules. They have a very interesting rule in the Dominicans. It's in no other order. In an order, let's say we're Jesuits. You know, in the Jesuit order, we have the ability to make a rule. Let's say we make it a rule that no Jesuit can own a Cadillac. Let's say we make that a rule. We could make that a rule in the Jesuit order. Not only that, we could bind our members by sin, so that anyone in the community who actually bought a Cadillac would have in fact committed a sin. You could actually bind yourself that way. Religious orders can bind their members by sin to certain rules like that. You know, the Dominicans can't. Dominic forbid them to bind anyone to sin. He says, we're in the world to spread salvation, not create sin. So he says, you have no ability to bind anyone to sin. And so his community then went on that the prayers were not to be elaborate, the rules were not to bind under sin, and he gave up authority so that people could really concentrate on this preaching. Another big thing for Dominic was contemplation, but he believed that contemplation was to flow from the liturgy. Now, contemplation could be from the readings, it could be from the ceremonies themselves, could be from the homily, it could be whatever. But he thought contemplation should flow basically from the liturgy. One of the cute stories about Dominic that we have is that very often, after everyone had sort of left the chapel, if you came in later, you'd find Dominic actually having a debate with himself, talk as though there's another person, and he's talking about an idea from the liturgy or whatever it is. And I think that's very interesting, because if you want to be a good speaker, you don't prepare your ideas quietly. You prepare them talking, because that's the way, if that's the way you're going to present the ideas, that's the way you have to prepare them. He made study with regards to preaching so much a part of the society that, do you remember the Benedictines divided their day into prayer, study, and manual labor? Dominic embraced manual labor, doubled the time to study. So they had 2 blocks of study, 1 of prayer, and that's the way their thing was set up. Community life was always for the sake of preaching. People's preaching assignment should alter when things take place in the community, and so that everything was organized around the preaching. Once that was set up, then prayers and everything else came in second. Now, to put this together, if I were to go through Augustine, what Augustine left us was an ideal of religious life, where people are actually friends. What Benedict left behind was a rule. What Francis left behind was an example. But what Dominic left behind was a task. And so the community, the community of Dominicans, their task is to preach. Now, with regards to spirituality, if we were to look at Dominic as a model for spirituality, it would be a matter of any person here finding their spirituality within their task. And I should mention that at the Second Vatican Council, that's one of the things the Council told priests to do. They told Catholic priests that you must find your spirituality within your ministry. It's not that your spirituality is here. Your spirituality is within your ministry. Your spirituality should more develop while working in the parish than it would on a retreat. That it should be tied somehow to this. And that is very easy to do with preaching. One of the reasons is that if you've ever involved in preaching, what normally happens is you say more than you've prepared, or you say it differently than you've prepared it. And one of the big things about preaching is to really listen to yourself. Okay? That's the same in teaching, teachers and stuff like that. If you prepare a class, unless you read your notes, and if you read your notes, of course, your students will be asleep anyway, so it doesn't much matter. Okay? But if you honestly do a presentation, a regular presentation, you'll always say something other than you prepared. And you really need to listen to yourself, because it's for you to learn from that. And the Vatican really wanted that with regards to clergy. But I think another way an example of that would be a lawyer. A lawyer, if he can see his life as at the service and help of people in really need, lawyers could very easily find his spirituality within his task. Certainly true of medical people, certainly true of teachers. There's all kinds of things in the world. And I remember one time, my dad, in the many different things he did as a young man, for a while he was a salesman, and he was an excellent salesman. But it was very interesting that he had a couple of really good offers that he simply wouldn't be involved in because he didn't think the product was good. And I've always thought of that as a model, that he basically saw this. He was going to sell you a product that really was good for you, or he wasn't going to sell it. So the people in sales can do that too. You know, that a person in sales in some companies where they really put the time into that, you know, you can tell the person exactly what you have to spend. You won't spend a penny over it, and they'll make sure you get exactly the best thing for you in that money. You can go somewhere else, and it'll always be slightly above what you thought you could spend. But it's the idea of learning to see your task as your ministry, and your task, rather, as your spirituality. Now in Francis, if you want to follow Franciscan spirituality, the idea is to strive for simplicity. And remember, it has to be simplicity according to your particular way of life. The simplicity of a parent is not the same as the simplicity you could find in a life where the children are gone and the husband and wife are retired. There's a level of simplicity that's possible there that is impossible for a parent. But there is a level of simplicity possible for each and every life. And so if you were looking for a Franciscan theology, what you strive in your life is for this simplicity. And the purpose of simplicity is to experience life as fully as you possibly can. Okay? I had two scripture texts. One was for Francis, and one was for Dominic. And in the service we had last night, we used them. But I will give them to you. The first is from the Gospel of Matthew. You recognize it, and this is for Francis. It's Jesus began to teach them by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And the passage we used with regards to Dominic is taken from Paul's letter to Timothy. Proclaim the word. Be persistent, whether it's convenient or inconvenient. Convince, reprimand, encourage everyone with all patience and with teaching. Okay, see if there are any questions.